Welcome to What the Theory with your man Joel. And Joel, here we are, double teaming the presentation today. Alan, stop laughing. I'm trying to be serious. Anyway, welcome to What the Theory with Joel. It's been a while, a couple of weeks since we last recorded. And I wanted to first tell you what's coming up on our recording schedule. Soon we'll be having, I think it's the fourth episode. Is it the fourth episode of PPJ? Those two hoodlums have decided that they'll join me again for another discussion. So I think I'll take some of your comments and questions that they might be able to discuss and then see how that conversation goes. It's always fun having them on the pod. Today's episode, I thought I was going to talk about a continuation on enjoyment, but something happened earlier this week that gave me the idea of talking about ideology and propaganda. So today's episode is about propaganda, and I'm going to talk about it from three perspectives. One is ideology, the other is the idea of the masses, and the last one is the conceptualization of propaganda as put forward by Edward Bernays in his book Propaganda. Right, so earlier this week, I was on the internet, which is always a bad thing to do. I was, just wasting time scrolling, and I saw this post about, I think it's a text message from parents in KPS talking about how the fact that there's, I think it's a scholarship scheme that's getting, for lack of a better term, what was it saying? We're a group of concerned parents at Kampala Parent School who prefer anonymity. What we see is a betrayal and a degree of disloyalty to us parents who pay huge sums of money to maintain school activities that sustain our kids' school attendance. School management has decided to freely integrate kids like Champion Ogudo's Fresh Kid on free bursaries and give them free quality education, which others pay for expensively without our consent. It becomes double crossing. So they go on to talk about how they feel because they're paying for a lot of for good education for their children, that it's unfair for other people to be getting it for free. And it sparked a whole conversation. And I think the way I looked at it was the way we framed the discussion just reminded me of ideology. Like the very fact that we feel like because we have to pay for something, it should be quality, and because someone else is not paying, they shouldn't receive the same quality. While at the same time talking about how education is meant to be the pathway to freedom or the pathway towards getting a better life. Those two ideas don't really make sense. And then I posted something along the lines of real estate, because I keep hearing everyone talk about how real estate and housing is a great investment. While at the same time, we think housing should be a human right. Those two things don't make sense together. And it brought back, what is called in philosophy, the antinomies of reason. Like things which make sense in and of themselves, but if you try and put them together, they become a paradox. They become something irreconcilable. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, the way ideology frames the options and the things that we look at in our lives. And to start with ideology, I've never found a very good definition of it, but the best that I've been able to, summarize is that ideology is what structures the chaos of our lives. If you see a child is, trying to figure out what the world means, sights, sounds, smells. It's always asking questions. It's also trying to figure out what's going on because children are yet to become ideological. And education in school, the way they're raised by their parents, gives them a framework by which they understand and order what is good, what is bad, what is meaningful, what should be focused on. And the history of philosophy, if I'm to take a small detour on these things, I promise you it's going to make sense. So in the oldest tradition, if we go back to the likes of Socrates and Plato and the rest, if you've just had their names, you may be wondering what those guys were even talking about, like how is it relevant to us today? But the thing that was being asked in the pre-Socratic days, that is thousands of years before the birth of Christ, was what is the nature of reality? And there were two ideas, one by a guy called Heraclitus and another by a guy called Parmenides. So Heraclitus is someone who thought that the fundamental nature of reality is change, that everything is always in flux. He's the one who said something along the lines of, you cannot step in the same river twice, because The waters are always changing. The composition of what constitutes that river or that body of water is always different. And you yourself as a person has changed. So you technically can't step in the same river. Nothing ever remains the same. Everything is always on its way to becoming something and has always been something. And then you have Parmenides. Parmenides was of the thought that, well, reality is one thing. And if something is one, it cannot be something else. It doesn't make sense for me as Joel to say that I'm Joel and I am also going to be not Joel tomorrow, yet you still call that thing Joel. So there was a fundamental clash there. Is the nature of reality permanent change, flux, as Heraclitus talked about, or is it fundamentally the same? And all these changes are mere illusions and changes. So that continued for a long time until our big wrestling dude Plato showed up. And the reason he's called the sort of godfather of everything philosophical is, rather than putting those two things against each other, he said that through a dialectic, through conversation, you can find the truth that is residing in 2 points of view which seem irreconcilable. And that's where the dialectic comes into play. When you read his work, he puts Socrates as the main figure in those discussions, but it's always through conversation. If I keep debating with you, I have a point of view, you have a point of view. For it to make sense, we have to be seeking definitions. And definitions allow you to find out what something is and what something isn't. And that if two people have a conception, we might have partial conceptions, but through our conversations, we get to figure out what that thing actually is. So the dialectic, as it's called, is a way of shaping our ideologies. It's a way of understanding how you and I agree on what the nature of reality is. Now, fast forward from all of that, throughout all the decades of everything that's been written philosophically, all theory that has been developed, all the way through to the Enlightenment, to questions of is rationality more important than empiricism? The biggest question has always been, how do we tell that something is real versus something is simply an appearance? Now, that distinction, Plato's suggestion on that was that the things that are in flux are the things of less importance than the things that are permanent. So take numbers, for instance. If you went out into the world and I said, show me the number 5, you can't show me the number 5. You can show me 5 things. 5 is instantiated in the way you count the number of materials. The internal rules of, say, the Pythagorean theorem are always going to be true. Whether you went out and measured the number of different corners, you probably won't get an accurate reading of that. My teachers used to say things like, my first philosophy professor used to say, if you add 7 and 4, you get 11 every single time. But if I told you to add 7 kilograms to 4 kilograms, you might get a little bit close to 11 or not. And even the idea of kilogram, where does that come from? Where does that conception reside? So in his thought, numbers are an example of something that does not change. It is forever. It resists all transformation. And the things that change are mere observations. And so this is where you end up with things coming all the way down to like stuff like the Matrix. I'm sure if you have a cousin, father, God help you if you've got a partner who's like really into conspiracy theories, they'll always say things like, that's what it appears to be, but there is the truth behind it. And the most ideological position that exists, I think, is one in which you're seeking to go beyond appearances and see what the truth is. Now, after I look at all of that, I was starting to think about what is it that shapes my ideology? What is it that shapes the way I see the world? In the current world as it exists, it's neoliberal ideology. And what is neoliberal ideology? It is the popular thought that free market enterprise, individualism is the way to live. It is the basis upon which we get good things to happen. The fact that the free market is going to give people options and that the freedom of the market is a representation of what freedom actually means. So when I look at this example of the school, for instance, the ideology that we've imbibed is you pay for a good quality product. And that good quality product allows your child to get the best kind of education, that will get them the best kind of job, and they will be able to compete in the marketplace of ideas. Now that idea resides in some instance with the fact that we think everyone should have equal opportunity. But equal opportunity if it's based on my ability to pay, it's not really equal. Me and Sudhir trying to get the same quality of education, if he has more money, he's definitely going to get better education, in quotations. But if you even examine that, does it mean because you paid more that you got a better education or you have a better experience? That remains to be seen. Ultimately, when I look at the ideology that we live by, the difference between ideology and an idea is a thought that you come up with using whatever is available. But ideology is something that has you. It has already shaped the way you think about things. It shapes the options that you have, the things that are presented to you. I was talking to someone about the best ideological product I've ever seen, a consumer product, and that's Coca-Cola. Now, if you just stop for a second and try and think, do you really like the taste of Coca-Cola? Like, do you ever go, I really can't, this is the best tasting product ever? No, but the fact that it's been positioned as something that you think of when you're thirsty on a hot day, the option of picking Coca-Cola shows up in your brain. It's not that it freely came there. The feeling of thirst is something that has existed throughout society, throughout human existence. Alan, when I say thirst, I'm talking about other things. So thirst is pivotal to being a human being. But how you satisfy that thirst, that is an ideological position. The options that you have to pick. Now, if we limit freedom to the fact that you get to choose between Coke and Pepsi, or between Renzori mineral water or Aqua Sippy, that gives you the feeling that you have freedom, but you don't have the option to change and reframe the options that are given to you. And that's where the true freedom comes in. And that's what the ideological presupposition that I'm talking about is. Let me read you something from Louis Althusser. So Louis, there have been sort of three conceptions of what ideology is. There have been more than that, but I'm going to give you three ideas. One is by Louis Althusser, in which he sort of believed that ideology is not just a set of ideas or beliefs, but a system of representation that shapes how individuals perceive and interpret the world. His argument is that ideology is transmitted through various institutions, that is, education, through media, and through religious organizations. Now, it's if you go back far enough in time, for instance, human beings used to believe that there was a divine right to kings, that the person who's ruling over you was ordained by God to rule over you. Now, if you talk about the divine right of kings, it becomes a bit silly. Now we talk about the people being the ones who decide who should rule over us, which is a complete ideological reframe. Now, when you go through school, when you listen to different types of music, when you imbibe all kinds of movies, there's a certain message that is being given to you. It's not an intentional message. It's not that people are sitting in Marvel Studios trying to come up with something. I watch a lot of reviews of movies, and there is a sort of cheap version of what they call propaganda. And the version of propaganda they talk about is, well, they're going to tell you about wokeism. They're going to tell you about like women can do anything, or like we have to have diversity quotas. And anyone who's sensible sees through that BS, whether you're on the left or you're the right. You see it as definitely performative. It's just simply gesturing towards real change and not actually instantiating it. Now, the reason for that is a corporation doesn't really care as long as you're making it money. Every movie that you've ever watched probably has an evil corporate executive who's the villain of the movie, and yet you forget that those are the same people who are making those films. It's because really it allows you to play out a fantasy. There is a fantasy that we subdue within ourselves, and then we get a release through entertainment. Now, because Captain America ends up beating, what was his name? Red Skull. What was his name? Yeah, Red Skull. You don't really have to fight. you sort of exorcise those demons by watching what you're watching on the television screen. Now, because the screen and entertainment and media have become so much more powerful, I think we're in a different position where we get to vent our frustrations. We get to attack people on Twitter. We get to say things that make us feel better about ourselves without necessarily having to take action. And ideologically, it gives you a sort of release valve, but it doesn't change or shift anything because the power dynamics remain the same. We can call people evil, we can say, well, this is despicable, and never questioning why we have a system in which that continues to happen. It goes back to the first time I read Marx. Now, before I read Marx, You know, I realize every time I say Marx, people go, it's going to make us a bearded socialist or something of that sort. But one, I found that I had an image of what he was talking about that was quite off, because it was already ideologically shaped. It was given to me as this is an idea that failed, or it's completely evil, or they want to take your stuff. And then when I read it myself, I was like, that's the furthest thing from what he was talking about. His position was, what... I promise I don't have a child farm here. I don't know why they're yelling. Anyway, I mean, you're talking about exploitation, and yet I may have children working for me. I'm going to stay on point. Now, when I started reading Marx properly, his idea of ideology was that the material conditions that we live under shape the way we think. They shape our relations. So I work for somebody, for instance, someone's my boss. And because of that relationship, there are certain ways in which the boss-employee relationship, that dynamic continues throughout time and space, as long as there are people who own capital and those ones who only own their labor and they sell it. And his view is that whatever culture you build on top of that, whatever art you represent in that, as long as the material basis doesn't change, then everything above it is going to remain stable. Anything that is completely going to be revolutionary will not only change at this stop, it won't be performative, but it will look at those relations of production. It will say, well, why should you be the one to own all the property? Why should you be the one who owns capital? If I'm working for your business, why don't I get a share of those profits over and above the amount that I've agreed to as a wage? Now, when you start talking about that stuff, that's when things really start changing. Now, when we go back to this example of people who were talking about, you know, we pay a lot for school, and why are these people getting to enjoy that product for free? We feel like we're being cheated. I understand that feeling. It's because you've been told that you have to bust your ass, work hard, make money, give your kids a chance to make something of themselves. But, you know, if you follow that logic long enough, you realize that it's going to only continue going higher and higher. You have to keep paying more and more money in order for you to get more and more of an exclusive right to education. And so education, which is meant to be a human right, has now become a commodity. And it being a commodity means the more valuable it is, it means that you're paying more and more for it. If you're paying $100,000 for you to go to university, it must mean something. And if someone doesn't pay that much to get there, it must mean something. And then you start to see that we are creating our own pain. We're creating our own issue. If you stopped a parent and said, do you think everyone has the right to have education? They would say, of course. So the way we live, ideology is almost an unconscious representation of what we are doing every day. It's not an explicit belief, and that's the key thing that I learned from reading Marx. The quote that I like to give is when he said that a commodity seems to you just a normal thing, like this laptop seems like a normal thing, because you don't think it's magical, I don't think it conveys to me anything superior. But in the way that I behave with it, when I buy it to signal that I'm an Apple guy, I'm not a, what is the other brand? I don't even know, because I'm an Apple guy. No, but if I buy it to signal that I am superior, even if it's in the background of what I'm thinking, it doesn't matter that in the foreground I know it's just a laptop. The way it materially presents itself, the way it objectively creates an illusion, I am treating it like it's more than just a commodity. And that's what Althusser means in terms of, it's a set of ideas or beliefs, a way of representing the world, that is not necessarily conscious, but it's an unconscious activity that motivates you. The other is the way Walter Benjamin, who was an art critic, talks about what he thinks of ideology. And this is, so basically was concerned with how technology and culture shape our perception of reality. So Benjamin had the idea of an aura. And the idea of an aura was like a piece of art, like the one behind me right there. Look at this handsome lad. So in his conception, traditionally a piece of art is something that occupies not only a thought of an artist, but it occupies space and time. And it being here at this point in a certain context, the experience of it gives an aura. But with technology and culture, you can start to mass produce art. You can start to mass produce something that, for instance, was meant to be traditionally experienced one-on-one. One idea that I've always found interesting is how there's a philosophical movement that thinks writing and actually recording is lessening the context by which ideas are to be conveyed. So someone like Plato, for instance, would have said that sitting in the presence of someone and having a debate with them is much more enriching than you reading their ideas, because you can decontextualize them from tone, from attitude. There is no one-on-one. Like, human connection has always been about the presence of another human being by which you get to mutually recognize a conception or idea. So if you now remove that, you decontextualize it, you lose a certain aura. Now, that loss of aura contributes to the decontextualization of the artwork and its detachment from the original social and historical context in which it was created. So it's rooted in the ways cultural production and reproduction change a piece of art. Now, maybe let me talk about what content creators then become, a term that I found really prescient. Whether you're making a podcast like the one I'm doing, if I just scroll through my YouTube, there are people putting up basketball channels, there are people doing movie analysis, there are people doing all kinds of high-value male podcasts. Like, all of that is in one place. Now, despite what the content is, if you've heard the term from Marshall McLuhan saying that the medium is always the message, it doesn't mean that the medium alone is the message. It means that the content is not as important as the medium. The medium itself conveys a certain message. If I wanted to propose to marry someone that I was interested in, the content of what I'm saying is, I want you to be my wife, I want you to be my partner, and I want us to live our life together. I could convey that in a text message, I could do it as a phone call, but me doing it those ways, the medium relays a certain message. Text is about convenience. It's about making it easy for me to convey something to you without me having to be there. Making a phone call probably is because there is a long distance aspect to it, and I'm sort of utilizing it to communicate to you without having to bridge that distance. If I did that, I would almost be seen as a bastard, because the medium is containing the message that's more important than the content of what I'm conveying. So what is the medium of, say, YouTube? What is the medium of social media? It makes it such that life can be bite-sized. It can become something that you can consume. We're flattening each other and creating a lot of content. We're pouring more and more of ourselves online, hoping to have some kind of connection. Now, if you watch this channel, you probably feel like you know me to some extent, but I'll ask, how well do you really know me? You only see me in a certain context. You only see me in a certain mood, presenting myself in a certain way. For us who become the content creators, the message that is purveyed to us is, your content will only reach an audience if you present it in a certain manner. You know those Mr. Beast thumbnails? Those things are, by the way, they are so dystopian. Every time I see them, like, why is he always so happy? Well, maybe because he has a lot of money. But why do we all have to have that? You know that, are you going to do a thumbnail like that of me when I'm like, like, everything looks that way, no matter what the content is. And I can't help but feel like every time I'm scrolling, I could land on someone giving a heartfelt message about pregnancy that they lost, and then scroll up a little bit and then see that there is conflict in Egypt and Ethiopia. Then scroll down and see that someone was slapped because, they said something stupid about a woman. Then you scroll down a little bit and then there's a nice little dance package. Like, all of it becomes consumable and the same. And I can make comments on it, I can laugh and then move on. Dave Chappelle has a really good joke about how he went onto YouTube one time and then saw a beheading. And then all he could do was like, don't like. Like, that's the only way you can give your feedback. Like or don't like. And that flattening loses the aura. It doesn't stay with you as long. And yesterday I was also thinking about our memories. The things before the internet, I kind of have memories of how stuff was, but that's because it was memorable to me. Now, because we record everything, something can outlast its generation or outlast its relevance. And because it's still recorded, it seems like it was significant. And we almost have prosthetic memories. If you try and think about the 90s, the people who I work with, who are much younger than me, have a vision of what the 90s were, and I have a vision of what the 90s were, and those are very different things. They are things of recognition that I have, which are, I already had an idea or a memory of that, and this is just reminding me of it, but they have manufactured memories of it. And that's what I mean by the ideological machine that is presenting this information shows it up to you as an aesthetic that you can take on. If you want to become a punk, for instance, in punk culture, it means you just dress up the way you want. If you want to be a revolutionary, just put on the hat, do the black power sign, and you're there. You don't really have to go through the ideology and understand and live it. You can just take on the aesthetics and appear to be that way. And what's the difference? Because everything is appearance anyway. So that goes back to the discussion I was talking about at the beginning, about the difference between appearance and what is solid. And if I go to the third definition of ideology, this is about the cultural hegemony. And cultural hegemony means, this Marxist Antonio Gramsci was trying to square the idea of why is it that, because the thought was all through history, it's been the struggle of different classes, those people who own the means of production and those who don't, and the enfranchisement of the masses who've always wanted to get more and more access to power, to being able to get a say in politics, which is how groups decide their living conditions. That hasn't really gone the way people expected. Like, there were some revolutions, but now most people are comfortable getting, some nice amenities, purchasing a few goods, but are not really interested in, changing the underlying social structure. And his view was that because the ruling ideas of the ruling class have become the ideas of everyone. You've probably had the idea that we can imagine the end of the world before we imagine the end of capitalism. Now, where that comes from is you don't even have the option of thinking that you can change the way things are. It just seems like that's just how stuff has always been. And the best salvation for you is that you work hard, make enough money so that you become the new boss. You become the new person in charge of everything. Not that you're going to upend everything else. Now, if you ask someone individually, they might think that that's bullshit. Now, the idea of cultural hegemony and belief is that it's not that you have to genuinely believe it, you just have to think everyone else believes it as well. This is where Slavoj Žižek uses the example of Father Christmas and how the idea of Father Christmas and Santa Claus has persisted through time. Almost everyone doesn't believe that that's a serious thing. No adult thinks that, there's actually a Santa Claus who comes and gives you presents. Young children maybe believe it while they're toddlers, but then they grow to an age where they no longer believe it. But it usually persists beyond that belief. And his view is that, the parents know that they're buying the gifts, but they just don't want to disappoint the children, keep them believing in magic. Now, the children keep receiving the gifts and they know their parents are buying it, but they don't want to disappoint their parents by making them think that they no longer believe it. So neither the parent nor the child believe in Santa, but nevertheless, the idea persists. So no one really holds the idea, but it has a sort of material, structural force that keeps things going. Similarly, if we look at the way things are arranged now, ideology is just something that it's a virtual thing. No one specifically believes it, but when you begin to have discourse, it shapes how our discourse goes, the options that we look for. Say traffic, for instance. I'm going to do an episode on why I think the car is one of the worst inventions ever. But if you're talking about how we're going to deal with traffic and transportation, it's always about widening the lanes. It's always about making sure we have bigger highways. But never about should we have cars or should we have a different version of mass transit. It's never about shifting the frame of the conversation. It's more about there's only one way we can go. It's just keep increasing what we already have. Now, as I mentioned, I was going to talk about ideology. I've talked a little bit about the masses. So why are the masses important? Let me read you something from Edward Bernays. Here it is. Universal literacy was supposed to educate the common man to control his environment. Once he could read and write, he would have a mind fit to rule. So ran the democratic doctrine. But instead of a mind, universal literacy has given him a rubber stamp. Rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with trivialities of the tabloids and the platitudes of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamps are the duplicates of millions of others, so that when those millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. it may seem an exaggeration to say that the public gets most of its ideas in this wholesale fashion. The mechanism by which ideas are disseminated on a large scale is propaganda, in the broader sense of an organized effort to spread a particular belief or doctrine. So I said I was going to talk about propaganda, and this is from Edward L. Bernays from the book Propaganda from the 1920s. Now, Edward Bernays, I believe he's a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was hired to sort of help marshal support for the American army when they were going through the Great War. And in that time, he learned that, you know, when you look at old-timey war propaganda, like if you watched Captain America, in retrospect, it seems very silly. It seems very on the nose. But at the time, you don't know that you're going through propaganda. And the idea was, he thought that when we try and think in masses, we receive ideas that the thoughts of the common man through literacy were supposed to be that you're given the independence to have your own thought. However, more and more, he found that it's not that people are dumb, it's that people are lazy. The natural human being is lazy. Why do more work than is necessary for you to understand something? You want to go along to get along. Then the imprint, this bit where he says, instead of a mind, universal literacy has given him rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with trivialities of the tabloids and platitudes of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Now, this is why I wanted to sort of close this off. When I think of propaganda, I don't think of it as a necessarily bad thing. It's taken on a difficult name. I recently learned that there used to be departments of propaganda just blatantly named in the military, but then they started getting terrible connotations. So now they changed them a little bit. Now, you know, this is the same guy that led to the development of public relations. Now, when he talks about public relations, the idea was that because human beings are, even when you're sitting in your own home, let me read this quote again from you from Propaganda. Men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be the subject of the influence of mass psychology. Because man is by nature gregarious, he feels himself to be a member of a herd. Even when he's alone in his room with the curtains drawn, his mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on it by group influences. Edward Bernays' career was really interesting. One of the things you may have heard if you've done marketing before is he's one of the people who helped make cigarettes quite popular. And how did he do that? He was around the time of the women's suffragette movement, in which he was sort of talking as cigarettes as torches of freedom. It was unladylike for women to smoke. And so he saw feminists and women as people who are saying we're breaking the traditional bounds. But by consuming this product, I am signaling to you that I'm the kind of woman that doesn't, you know, hold sway or doesn't hold to certain patriarchal values. So the combination of buy this product because it will allow you to be the kind of person that you want to be. That is where modern advertising came from. That goes back to Coca-Cola. They're not selling you the drink per se. They're selling you a certain feeling. Or even Nike. They're not really talking about the shoes. They're talking about who you need to be. They pick the athletes that you're supposed to be idolizing, someone like Michael Jordan, to give you the feeling like if you wear his Jordans, somehow his mindset, like somehow, if you ask someone, are you now going to be able to dunk? Of course not. But you kind of have the aesthetic, you kind of have, you're in line with him, you know, you're pro Jordan, therefore you have a certain mindset, you're a winner, you're not a loser, you're not, you know, the downstream from that, you kind of have, and I took that personally, like you start to mold your perception in that way. And that's where he's sort of saying that even if you look at the ideas and thoughts we have, like when I try and examine why do I believe certain things, there's too much information out there, and so I just take the scientific data as it is and I take it as if it's my opinion and I haven't wrestled with it long enough. The good part of propaganda, though, is things like getting people to do mass drives. In Uganda, for instance, when the AIDS epidemic was really a scourge in this country, the move towards ABC, that was propaganda, you know. Abstinence, I don't know why abstinence was the first one, because I'm sure people first went, let's go to B. Abstinence, be faithful, use condoms. And you know, that's another thing about propaganda. Like it's never really, how can I say, never super sophisticated. We always have this idea of people sitting in a back room somewhere controlling the levers, but that's not what it is. It is that because we're all swimming in it, unbeknownst to us, we just go about our daily activities. Marketing manager is just trying to get you to buy a product. But the options available to him are what he's going to present to you. You're going to take those options and make those the only options you present to your children. And because of that, it becomes a self-reinforcing wheel with no one in particular in charge. The only time you start to see who might be in charge is the people who benefit the most from the system as is. The people who benefit are a little bit, it takes them much longer to get rid of this system. And that's why I also like Marx's view on this, in that it's not enough to moralize. It's not enough to say this person is evil, or that person is good, or this person is woke, or this person is not woke. That's a very silly approach to it, because the paths that people are choosing, you are looking at the ideology that has got a hold of them and then saying, well, you are immoral, or you I guess are a bleeding heart liberal, or you are cold-hearted conservative. That's another way of flattening discourse between us. Not to say that those people don't exist, but immediately we label each other that way and start to treat each other that way. And whatever you are labeled, you start to become. It prevents any nuance and any conversation. I'm going to read this is a spicy quote. You won't believe who said this. All propaganda has to be popular and has to accommodate itself to the comprehension of the least intelligent of those of whom it seeks to reach. I'll give you two guesses. Alan, who do you think said that? You know him well. Like it's a name everyone knows.
Is that Jordan?
No, close. When I say close, you're going to say what? No, not Slavoj Žižek. That's Adolf Hitler. Listen.
Just tell the world you know him well.
We know him well. And also when you said Jordan, I said close, it's because he had that little mustache also. But anyway, that's from Mein Kampf. And I think of, you see when you watch those old videos of Hitler and like the SS, it seems silly, he seems overly dramatic. But at the time, it was very convincing. He was able to get mass culture. Now, his point was, it doesn't matter how smart you seem, it matters how it resonates with people. And I was thinking about, like, say, Trump. Any populist movement has slogans. It's always something easy and repeatable that you can have people put themselves onto it. It's not difficult to understand because it has to move quickly, it has to spread quickly. Just do it for Nike. Or I think there was a promotion for Coca-Cola. The real thing. It was just called the real thing. It's a soda, but like it's the real thing. MTN, everywhere you go, there is a certain association with branding. It's not a material force, but it's what is the staying power of that idea in your mind. And the biggest thing for me is realizing how effective propaganda and marketing are on me. They shape my desires. I may long to be loved, but the things that I'm told are going to get me loved, when I retrieve those answers are popular because there's an ideology behind them. There is a certain shape that has been given to them. Now, as I paint this, the temptation is to think that we have to escape ideology completely. And there is no more ideological position than trying to escape ideology. I know it talks to you about the matrix and like you're going to unplug, you're going to take the red pill. That is the most ideological position because whatever they're presenting you is itself ideology. There is no way to get beyond appearances. So to go back to what Plato was saying is that yes, certain things change over time. And so in our dialectic, we change what our ideological lenses are. We can never be rid of them. I myself in this channel present an ideological lens that is left-leaning. I am aware of my bias. So someone who hates this would probably say this is propaganda. And yes, it's propaganda. I'm trying to get you to see things a certain way. But at the same time, it's not a fixed idea. It's not me denying the fact that these things exist. Common sense is probably the best form of masking what is ideological in the way that we move. So, yeah, that's the episode. I just wanted to talk about ideology and propaganda and how propaganda can be wielded to, get good causes. And as someone who's passionate about, things on the left or, passionate about more equality, I think there's a reproach for us because Similar to people in church, we've sort of taken the thought that because we think we're on the right side of history, that somehow there is a transcendental guarantee that the good will win in the end, and things will come to the bear. And so it's made us kind of lazy. What I've always found interesting in the Bible is when Jesus said that you have to be as wise as a serpent and as gentle as a dove. You have to be as wise as a serpent in terms of other people are using these mechanisms to get their ways forward. And if we want to live in a democratic society, it means that we have to be able to influence not just individuals, but the masses. We have to get ideas more and more popular. And I, for one, am going to engage in more and more propaganda. So thank you very much for watching the channel. I hope you got something out of it as usual. And watch out for the next episode of PPJ. We're going to fight those hoodlums outside. I'm going to give them some propaganda.